It being 11:05 a.m., the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
Private members' business started debate at second reading of Bill C-544, Elimination of Partisan Government Advertising Act, in the name of Mr. McGuinty.
Mr. McGuinty, seconded by Mr. Casey, moves that Bill C-544, an act to amend the Auditor General Act, Government Advertising, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. Debate. The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you and good morning, Mr. Speaker, to you and my colleagues here this morning in the House. Mr. Speaker, this bill, which is my private member's bill, which is supported by the Liberal Party of Canada, supported by my leader, supported by my colleagues, is an attempt to increase confidence, to drive up trust in our Canadian democratic institutions and the way in which government as a whole operates. It is about accountability. It's about value for scarce taxpayer dollars. It is about helping Canadians have more confidence in the way in which we collect their hard-earned dollars and spend them on their behalf. This bill, C-544, is about amending the Auditor General's Act to appoint an advertising commissioner to oversee government spending on advertising. Everyone in this House, Mr. Speaker, from all parties I have heard themselves from countless Canadians who are concerned with what can only be described as wasteful advertising spending. It's time to bring Canada's advertising rules into the 21st century, and the appointment of an advertising commissioner, as in other jurisdictions, will provide accountability for all Canadians. This legislation, should it be passed, and I'm always hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that we can get all party support in this regard, will apply to all future governments of any political stripe. Mr. Speaker, it's important to remind Canadians that this bill does, of course, permit legitimate advertising. There is a role and purpose for government advertising. I will come to the details in a moment in my bill. But what would be expressly prohibited is the kind of partisanship we've seen which infuses federal government advertising and has done so for the past 9 years under this Conservative government, where the common look and feel of government advertising is identical to the common look and feel of the partisan political Conservative Party advertising, which is being which is happening at the same time as the government uses public resources to do so for federal government advertising. It's important to remove partisanship from federal government advertising, Mr. Speaker, because it's anti-democratic when you use public resources to try and increase your chances for political success in Canadian society, particularly only several months away from a national election campaign. It's unfair. In fact, when I described this bill to a group of grade 5 students recently, Mr. Speaker, one of the students put up their hand, a 10-year-old, and said, what appears to me, it looks like it's just sort of cheating. And it's hard not to agree with that simple description, that it's about using public resources, harnessing those for an unfair advantage for a sitting government. The other reason why the partisanship has to go, Mr. Speaker, is because we're now hearing increasingly from experts and from good frontline, hard-working, dedicated public servants that this kind of advertising, in fact, compromises the neutrality and the objectivity of public servants and public service. More and more senior managers are being compelled, being forced to take actions which they know are favorably disposed towards the party in power at the expense of the neutrality and objectivity they signed up for when they decided to become good public servants. Look at any website operated by the federal government and take a look at the colours. Then go to the Conservative Party of Canada website and take a look at the colours there. So, Mr. Speaker, this partisanship issue is one that every member of this House of Commons knows cuts to the bone of fairness and accountability. There has been unanimous opposition, Mr. Speaker, to the government's continued advertising. The National Post, the Globe and Mail. Let's look at some of the headlines. Let's start with the Toronto Star. Tory ad blitz goes simply too far. The Globe and Mail. How partisan Conservative ads undermine the rule of law. The Canadian Press. Cabinet secrecy blocks rationale behind government's advertising slogan. National Post. Canadians growing tired of government's economic action plan call government's ads propaganda in recent survey. Drawing heavily, by the way, Mr. Speaker, on 8 polls conducted by the Department of Finance and the government's own government, its own department. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's also important to always juxtapose choices made by governments in the way in which they spend hard-earned taxpayer dollars with real needs in Canadian society. We know the government has spent some $780 million, likely more by now, on advertising since their arrival. Let's take a look at some of the forms of advertising that it has pursued. This government paid over $12,000 per train car to shrink-wrap GO trains in downtown Toronto with blue, conservative blue plastic shrink-wrapped with the slogan Economic Action Plan splattered all about it.
Shame.
They call that a message. Riders on the GO Transit call it propaganda. $12,000 per car, Mr. Speaker. Let's take a look at one of the more egregious examples that really, I think, highlights the need to take action in this area. The government has compelled municipalities and provinces around the country to spend $30 million to put up 9,850 billboards. And, Mr. Speaker, we have now learned through access to information requests, through working with municipalities, that municipalities were not able to get their federal infrastructure funding dollars unless they met a contractual condition, which was to put up Economic Action Plan billboards at the site of every project. The federal government goes to the province, says we want a Fed-Prov agreement. Then they go to the cities involved and they say, if you want any money, you need to put up a billboard at your expense. $30 million, 9,850 billboards. Let's talk about what that $30 million might do for Canadians at a time when there are scarce resources and so many credible needs in Canadian society. $30 million buys 15 MRI machines. $30 million pays for 500 registered nurses' salaries for 1 year. Or buys over 900 personal support workers for home care for 1 year. Pays for 10,000 hip, knee and cataract surgeries. Pays for 4,250 insulin pumps for our kids who are coping with type 1 diabetes and can't afford the pumps. It pays for 300 affordable housing units. It pays for 1 million bus passes for our seniors on pensions. It pays the tuition fees for 5,000 students. It pays for student jobs for 9,000 students over summers. It pays for 15,000 doses of chemotherapy drugs for our cancer patients fighting their heroic battles, waiting for their treatments. It pays for 46,500 injections to treat osteoporosis at a time when our aging population is showing more and more the effects of arthritis and aging. It pays for 20 million meals at the school breakfast programs for hungry kids. It pays for 46 years of the eliminated community access program for any one province when we were supplying internet services in our libraries and community centres for those who could not afford the $70, $80, $90 a month to be connected on internet. It pays for eco-energy retrofit grants for 6,000 homes. $12,000, Mr. Speaker, to shrink-wrap one train at a time when infrastructure funding is being cut 90% this year. It tells us everything we need to know, Mr. Speaker, about the government's priorities. It is shamelessly using federal tax dollars to promote its brand, its common look and feel, its websites, Facebook ads. For heaven's sake, Mr. Speaker, they're even advertising now on Xbox. This can all stop. The government, the party in power, can be put out of its advertising misery overnight. All it has to do is adopt this bill. Create an advertising commissioner who is empowered to review advertisements before they go to print. The bill goes as far as empowering the advertising commissioner, Mr. Speaker, to actually ensure that before a print run is performed, before any government sends out, for example, an order to a print house to run 30,000 or 2 million pamphlets, that be approved as well in advance to make sure. Now, I think the government has lost its way, Mr. Speaker, and particularly I think the Prime Minister has really lost his way in this regard. This is a person who came to Ottawa riding a horse called accountability, and he railed against this for years. He railed against this while he was in office, and he railed against it when he was out of office. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation itself can't understand why the Prime Minister is pursuing this kind of advertising policy, if you can call it that, and it also is supportive of this bill and these measures. So we have a situation, Mr. Speaker, where we can do right and we can do better by Canadians. We can look at the $760 million the government spent and say, did we really get good value for money? The bill allows for important messaging. And yes, it allows a government to actually inform Canadians about tax measures or programmatic expenditures or benefits they're entitled to. All of that is available, just not the way it's being done now. You would not be able, for example, Mr. Speaker, to advertise measures which don't exist. We can all recall several years ago the Advertising Standards Council of Canada taking the government to task for running ads on television during sporting events for programs around job training which didn't even exist. Did not exist. For those Canadians who follow playoff hockey, Mr. Speaker, they're watching ads now. Each spot is a minimum of $100,000. $100,000, no message. That would provide support for 300 student jobs over this summer. So it's important for us to remember that when we talk about this kind of advertising, we need to juxtapose it, to say it again, we need to juxtapose it against real needs in Canadian society. And that's why I'm bringing this bill forward. It allows, in conclusion, for the important advertisements, to go back to that theme. If we're recruiting staff, it's permitted. If you're looking for contractors to do good work for the federal government, it's permitted. If you want a message out on health crises like H1N1 or the SARS crisis, that's permitted. If you need to message to folks in southern Alberta during a flood, that's permitted. All of this would go a great distance, Mr. Speaker, to come exactly back to where I began, to drive up confidence and trust in the way in which all governments operate, at a time when too many Canadians, in my view, unfortunately, are despondent, are disappointed, are checking out. This House has an obligation to do everything it can to drive up confidence. I remain hopeful, Mr. Speaker, and I ask my colleagues from all sides of the House to join us and support me in this bill so that we can do right by Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.